And I'm going to welcome and transition the mic over to our panel moderator, Fabiana Dacchini.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lauren, for having me here today, moderating this panel. I am one of the parent-patient partners in the IMPACT trials, and thank you for bringing 14 of us along to this incredible journey with the IMPACT trials. So I am a mother of a baby born at 26 weeks gestation. He's 12 years old now, and he's the reason why I'm here doing the work that I do today. And he's very complex, so a lot of things that I learned today, wow, is very applicable to us. But I want to highlight a comment that Norway made today. She said, we have to live with our decisions during pregnancy for the rest of our lives. The same apply to the decision we make in the NICU for our babies. So I just want to keep that in mind when you're talking about engaging parents in clinical trials. So we have a predetermined questions for our panelists today, and each one will have the opportunity to answer the questions, and then we're going to open to the floor to, I'm sure there's a lot of questions from you, to these amazing speakers. So we're going to kick off with Suvik and followed by Norway on the question, what makes a clinical trial meaningful?
Thanks, Fabiana, for kind of putting your life story into perspective, because I think that's the most meaningful. Is how the trial impacts the lives of the patient, and for NICU trials, the family as well. So as I had alluded to a little bit in my talk, the outcomes. I think that's the key in selecting the right outcomes, but also I tried to allude to a little bit is how it should align to the trial design, because not all outcomes that are perceived as meaningful from a family perspective may align with design. So for example, if you're trying to test, like it's a phase 1 trial of a new drug, then you may have to kind of look at more physiological surrogate outcomes that has an indirect effect. But if you're looking at a pragmatic trial, then yes, it should be the outcomes that you and other families have identified as the most important that will change the lives of your child. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I guess to me, I might take it up like a level even higher than that and just talk about how the evidence created by the clinical trial is meaningful to people. I mean, the outcomes are important, don't get me wrong. And I would actively encourage you all to include patients, people with lived experience in selecting those outcomes in different parts or in different parts of the design and conduct of clinical trials. But I would also just try to contextualize the research question to the lives of people using that evidence, right? To, because there are some, is it meaningful to them in making treatment decisions, right? Will it address an important gap at the end of the day? And just because I think that's kind of where it becomes so practical. It takes all of these concepts and really makes it impactful to people, using that data for decision making, whether it comes to pregnancy or in supporting their child, right? With complex healthcare needs. I mean, I was once that child as well. So anyways, all that being said, I think that's kind of where the meaning comes from my perspective. So
thank you. So Isabel, for you, what is the impact of a lack of diversity in clinical trials?
So I think as we've heard about how clinical findings from clinical trials that do not include a certain patient population or participant population can then be limited in terms of their generalizability. The lack of inclusivity and diversity in research and clinical trials is going to translate directly into a lack of information that is specific and that is applicable to a wider range of individuals. So we need to think in terms of health equity at each level of the research and including in the participation. But that's where I think the co-designing of the trial and the thinking of the designing of a trial in partnership with persons with lived experience and communities and diverse communities is particularly important, because the way that information, not only about the science that it is generated by the trial, is the way that this is communicated is important, but the way that information about the trial itself and about the process of doing the trial, how to communicate that information needs to also be developed in partnership with persons with lived experience who themselves have a diversity of identities, intersectional identities, and lived expertise, because the people that are going to be eligible and are going to be included and are going to be consenting to participating into the trial is going to also be a reflection of the process and the way the trial unfolded. So when we think about trial design, the process really needs to, that goes back to the first question. What makes a trial meaningful is not only the outcome and the impact and the evidence generated and what is going to be put into the world about what the output of the trial has been, the way that the trial has been ran, the way that the research questions have been framed, but the way that the consent material, the patient-facing material, the participant-facing material has been developed, whether it's been co-designed, whether there was input on the different baseline questionnaires, surveys that informed all the baseline demographics and all the data that will go into the trial is really crucial. And I think that's where we need to go, and think about trial design beyond the outcome and the generation of knowledge and translation of that knowledge, but start it in an integrated way.
Wonderful. Noe, can you answer the same question? I would love to hear your perspective coming from UK. The impact of lack of diversity in clinical trials.
Yeah, so I think, let me just go back quickly to the meaningful component. So one of the things from a sort of participant point of view, why it's meaningful, and just coming back to all of you here, is actually part of the reason you do it is, yeah, because you want to help others, but also from a personal point of view for the researchers. So I can't tell you the name of who delivered my baby, who gave me antenatal care, but I can give you the name of the 4 people that enrolled me and looked after me through my clinical trial. So just for you guys to have a bit of sense. So I think coming back to lack of diversity, I think it can be really limiting on what you can find out or where you can go. So again, the process is really important. Thinking about recruitment, if you don't have the right people in the first place, then you're going to be quite narrow in who it's going to be beneficial for in the long term. I think also one thing we need to remember more, especially for us that work in maternal health, is the inclusion of men. I think that's something that's often overlooked. So if men also use maternity services. They come and they might just be there when you deliver the baby, but when you have a chronic condition, they might also be part of the decision-making process on what you do with your medications or even your wider family. In some cultures where I've spoken to, that it's a family decision. So, but I think in particularly men are quite excluded. Where you deal with children, they're half of the product. So yeah, so I think that's really important, and just I guess to make sure it's relevant for everyone.
Okay, thank you. Natalie, you now, how can we make trials more equitable?
More equitable. How can we make trials more equitable? As I discussed in my talk, and I think that this was something that one of the panelists before also said, is that think big, but incremental change is where it's at. We really have to come together as a scientific community. We have to agree to share data. We have to, prioritize areas for research and work together as a scientific community. I think if we really want to answer these questions and we want to start including, populations that have been historically excluded from clinical trials, we want to do meaningful research, we really need to collaborate with each other and kind of come, all be on the same page, and not just in Canada, not just in the US, but really, I think an international collaboration, both with regards to, how are we going to be including these marginalized populations, pregnant populations, making sure that they're diverse and making sure that we're asking the right questions so that we really can improve the health of pregnant and lactating people. So I think it's really about collaboration.
Wonderful. Can we ask the same question for Carol? Because it would be very great to see the perspective of Europeans coming to this room on.
So thank you. I'm not native English speaking, so I asked a little bit to my neighbor some synonyms on your question. And I think I would like to simply illustrate it with one example. And if people want to read this, it's a very nice commentary or an editorial, I think in Pediatrics or in Journal of Pediatrics. It's called The Python's Embrace. And it's on the support trial. And you really have to take some time to read it. And they explain how their study got killed by additional input from the IRB. And actually, they calculated it relates to prevention of ROP. And they say, well, thanks to the way we have to communicate with our potential parents or potential patients, the parents of the patients, the way we had to communicate with them, actually, we failed to recruit Hispanic and Black American, I hope I'm using the right wording, Black American patients. So in essence, it meant that at the end of the story, this study is actually not applicable only to white on the results. And secondly, it took more than 2 years addition to recruit all patients. So actually they calculated how many additional children became blind thanks to the ethics input. So I think this is also, I mean, even for me, an old man, white, so not qualifying for any specific aspect, it is better that we recruit or as much as possible any patients, because we will get more robust and also sooner the information we need to guide our decisions. So that's a very pragmatic, economic approach perhaps, but it's crucial to understand we need to have everybody on board to have a relevant clinical trial.
Thank you. So let's open to the floor now. Do we have a microphone to pass around? Oh, wonderful. Okay.
Hi, I'm Joseph Ting from University of Alberta, Edmonton. Just have a questions of how, I think we all understand the importance of the perinatal clinical trials, but one of the biggest barrier or like the hurdle is about the consenting process. And especially with some ethics boards, they insist that the families need to have like 72 hours to consider for studies, and some say at least 12 hours, which I mean are completely reasonable among those like moms are under huge stress. So, but on the other hand, because of like sometimes of like we need to see the acute impact of some of the interventions, like those inotrope. So giving like 12, 72 hours is also difficult. So is there any good kind of like thoughts about how to tackle this type of the hurdle? Yeah, thanks. From both the physicians or the healthcare and also the family perspective.
Well, thanks, Joseph. I mean, you and I both have probably spent hours talking about this and banging our heads against the wall, especially around trials on resuscitation or trials with acutely sick patients where you have a very, very narrow time window, or even prophylactic drug trials where you have to give a certain dose within 6-12 hours. And these are usually the babies with a 30-40% risk of death. Just to put the number out there compared to the risk of death in all trials that people do across all ages, where the risk of death is probably less than 1%. So, and these babies get excluded because we are essentially catering to the needs of the research ethics board's members who have been advised in a certain way to look at and evaluate trials. So I think this is probably the platform where I hope we have enough members who are like enough people who are members of research ethics boards and chairs of research ethics boards, where the discussion needs to be spurred that are we actually doing any benefit to those sick babies by excluding them from the trials, by trying to stick to the norms? And what would parents think about this whole process? Yes, we need to get consent, but for some of these questions, can we look at waiver of consent? Can we look at deferred consent? And one thought that I have is that if there are more surveys, other publications that come from a parent perspective about their willingness to explore other consenting processes, maybe we can put that on the table when we put applications to the REB to see if they'll be willing to kind of look at other consenting approaches.
Okay, thank you. I think Natalie also.
So thank you so much for that. Just to add, not only do I think we should be revisiting the consent process, but I think we should be revisiting the way the REB structure. So, I think there were some really successful trials done during the COVID pandemic, and I think we should really learn the lessons of centralizing REB. Right now, every institution goes through their REBs, but really it could be regional or even provincial. And some REB centers at given institution lack expertise in pediatrics or in pregnancy and lactation. And it's going to be quite challenging to sort of staff all of those institutional REBs with the correct expertise. But again, if there's centralized sort of hub of expertise nationally, regionally, provincially, I think then we have a chance to make some of these changes. And also, we should not be reinventing the wheel. I'm a big fan of kind of harmonizing these processes. And I hope that we would be able to do this. We'd be able to share a consent form. It could be, as the SNAP trial showed, or that we could, it's really a drop-down list of additional questions if you're including pregnant people, or if you're in the NICU setting, or there should be some kind of like additional standardized, harmonized processes and tools. And this is something, again, that it sort of goes back to collaboration, but also centralizing these efforts and not kind of, all of this redundancy at the different institutional, that it ends up being really a barrier.
Thank you. Isabel or Laurie have? Okay.
Yeah, I'll be honest. It is a little perplexing to me. Like, I don't understand all the different processes that happen at the REB and whatnot, but what I think what I would advocate for, beyond what you were talking about in terms of, exploring what some of these policies are and kind of designing with the community, right? Because I think there are some clear, I could talk to pregnancy, but also just even with my own children or myself over time, right? About, how ethical is it to not include them, right? It's like flipping the paradigm, because even when we talk about equitable, in the traditional sense of equality, because I know our views of equality are, evolving as they should. It's treating everyone the same, but we're not actually treating these groups the same, at all. We're actively excluding them from the process. So it doesn't even meet our definition. So I guess for that reason, I would advocate for the inclusion of the communities affected by these decisions and research ethics processes, and in designing them and in implementing them and reviewing them at the REB level. Like, I don't have necessarily a lot of experience in that space, but I know other patients and community members have played those roles. So I would just ask that if we are going to centralize, that we ensure that there's been broad engagement of those groups, that we don't lose that somehow in the process of centralization. So
yeah, so every single researcher I've ever met hates ethics. So I thought it's interesting that you brought that up. So there's just a couple of things. So I was involved in a project for postpartum, so basically heavy bleeding at childbirth, and how they give the blood products. And when we did all our engagement work, it came up that deferred consent afterwards was fine. I don't know about the specifics of trial design, but one of the things they were talking about is, because there wasn't anything dodgy, it was quite like standard practices in other areas. In a couple of sites, they just changed the processes at hospital level, and they compared that with a hospital that was not using the blood products in that order. So I don't know, maybe it's also about being creative in your design. And then just a couple of other things around the barriers as well to recruitment. I think just a few things for you to keep in mind is thinking about, financial burden for patients to take part in clinical trials. I just want to make sure, you know, we mentioned that, because if you need them to go to a site, they might have to take a day off work or time off work. You know, you need to be able to cost in for expenses, thinking about being flexible in your design as well. If you're dealing with children, is it something that you can do, you know, at the weekend or at school to minimize the burden for parents? And also thinking about virtually, can you use virtual formats as well? So it just made me think about some of the barriers, and for you to consider that in your design as well.
And maybe just to conclude, from the literature, we know that the decision to participate in trial as pregnant individuals or early parents is a decision that is always going to be a very personal and intimate balance of risks and benefits according to personal values and preferences that include lived expertise, culture, life experience, journey, perception of risk. And all these things are so person-centered and so individual that it becomes very difficult to think about how to make the decision process collectively. And what I would really encourage researchers to do in this area is to ask specifically, you know, and to co-design specifically consent forms so that all the information that would be needed by individuals who are asked to take these decisions and to make these decisions in times of extreme stress, decisions that may impact, that may stay in their minds and hearts for the rest of their lives, that we make sure that when we design these consent forms, the information that they would like to see is there, without necessarily changing what is needed for the trial to make sense biologically. Of course, we can always add pragmatic aspects so that feasibility can be enhanced without, you know, without having a negative impact on the trial. But keeping the same parameters in place, patients, what you think participants may be worried about is probably not what they're truly worried about. So asking them at the very beginning about what they want to see on the consent process, I think, is really key to allow individual decision-making that we will never be able to anticipate as someone external to them.
Wow, that is so important. It's very relevant because I sit on the EDI for the One Child, Every Child with Dr. Bukola Salami, and she always talks about the historic abuse and lack of trust in the medical system because of history. And I think we have to understand that. Also, we talk about consent, and when I love Sylvik's picture, the young researcher coming to the room and you're so overwhelming in ICU, to really keep the trauma-informed approach, trauma-informed care approach when you're coming to talk to families, because we experience trauma and we don't know the history that we came to that point in our lives. Many of us go through many years of infertility treatment. And so there's so much history behind that is really to sit down with the patient and understand where we are at. And then I believe sit down and talk about the consent and enroll in clinical trials. So any other questions in the room?
This is an absolutely phenomenal panel, and I really appreciate everyone's insight. So I have two questions, and the first is actually very much touching upon what you just talked about, which is there is a lot of fear of clinical trials, of interventions, of doing things on people. And how do we parlay that with deferred consent? Because I see those two as diabolically furthering that narrative, even if the goal is actually to improve enrollment. And then secondly, you know, this is an amazing group of minds. How do we solve some of the consent issues at our REB levels? And so I've seen amazing attempts to do things like use pictorial diagrams or cartoons or other things to improve it. And that's a trial, and then you follow that with a 32-page sit-down consent to prove that somebody really actually preferred one page. And to me, that's how you actually improve access to limited communities who English may not be their first language, and particularly to some of those families in stress where they can't sit there and hear 32 pages, but maybe a handout or something to start that process would really improve it. So how do we drive that at our REB levels?
Thank you I think there's sort of two questions in there, and one of them is addressing the fear. And I don't live in Alberta, but Alberta has an excellent campaign that's sort of focused on demystifying participation in clinical trials, the Be the Cure campaign. It's really fantastic. And I think part of what we need to do is, as a community, is really, encourage and promote these types of campaigns that are directed at the general public and marginalized communities through Facebook groups or community leaders. But it's really, really important to kind of address this fear by proactively providing this perspective. And we're all sitting here in this room, and most of us are kind of in the know, but we really need to get that message out. And, and that's something we can do during the consent process, but it sounds like that's not the right time. And there needs to be, more of a general effort at kind of translating that knowledge, in addition to obviously well done informed consent. But if the informed consent process is basically at the way it is right now, it's like we're supposed to kind of teach them everything there is to know about, clinical research and why it is important and the particulars of this study, and also, paying attention to their cultural background and their perceptions and all of that, all, done by, one person sitting in a room in however many minutes. That's a lot, so there really needs to be a multi-pronged approach. And one of it is especially to address the fear. I think we really need knowledge translation campaigns that really reach the general public and all the different and the diverse communities that represents. With regards to informed consent itself, I think, there's lots of great ideas at this table. And I like I like that idea of sort of picture and kind of a condensed form. So maybe the bare minimum needs to be decided as a group, what is that bare minimum? And then the additional kind of information in the fine print can always be added.
Thank you. Carol?
Yeah.
Sorry.
There is one potential technical solution. It's called e-consent, where you actually rather stress the process than the event, where patients can go back or can find additional information. So indeed staggered information. And I personally am happy with a no if the informed consent was accurate. So the finality of the informed consent is not a yes. The finality of an informed consent is a informed decision by, in my case, the parents in general. So that's the 2 points that I want to make. And just again to illustrate it, I was involved in a phase 1 PK study for new antibiotic, fun. 2 parents were PhD students in pharmaceutical science. So they know everything. And they said, after informed consent, Professor, very kind, we fully understand that we should say yes, but we do not dare. And so there's something that you have to respect, because knowledge and behavior are different parts of a personality. But I'm rather lucky in Belgium, patients are very interested in clinical trials. But if you look throughout Europe, there's also quite some diversity on that. So there's rather a cultural thing, and indeed informing the general public, whatever, is a way to go.
Okay, Solveig.
Yeah, just would love to kind of respond to the deferred consent issue in relation to the ICU setting, because it's a common problem that we have. And I think a lot of it is to do with the type of intervention, because in the ICU, as I mentioned, there are broadly 2 types of interventions. One is that we are testing established practices, and there's a whole lot of variation, and we do not know which one is better. Regardless of whether a child is in a trial or not, they probably have 50% probability of being exposed to one or the other because of physician differences, biases. So in those cases, when we approach it as a clinical trial, there is a fear among some people that I do not want my child to be a guinea pig for research. And sometimes it is rather difficult to explain. It depends on the research coordinator, whoever is talking to the parent, is that, well, regardless of whether you're in a trial, your child will be exposed to one or the other either way. So can we kind of look at deferred consent for some of those interventions which are accepted practices, but there is variation, versus if you're testing a novel therapy, a novel drug, and you have time to sit down and talk to families, then it is difficult. And we should not be using that opportunity to kind of push for deferred consent, where you should be sitting down, talking to families and talk about the process. But there could be novel management approaches which are very time sensitive. Again, I kind of go back to resuscitation trials. Like, we follow NRP, a lot of things in NRP has absolutely no evidence base to it in the population that we apply on. And are we harming babies? Probably yes, because we do not know what we are doing, but we do not have time to explain to parents that here's this newer approach to resuscitating your child. So that is where I think, again, we need to go back to parents and kind of explore that, whether in those situations, even with a novel therapy, can deferred consent be an acceptable approach, and bring it back to the RAB when we are putting our application in.
Okay.
I don't know if that would work.
Thank you. Have one more question here.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Great presentation, very informative and very empowering for me as a caregiver. I'm a patient partner. My name is Gunjan, and I live in Toronto. I have a lot of curiosity, and curiosity comes because of my lived experience as a proud immigrant and as a caregiver of a child with autism, ADHD, and asthma. I wonder, we're talking about clinical trials. Where do you see the role of psychological safety and caregiver well-being play in this journey? How are you building the foundation of caregiver well-being in this work in continuity, in collaboration with parents and caregivers? And I have another curiosity. I struggle immensely in research that we are hearing those who are always heard in the system, but we're not hearing those who have never been heard in the system. We do have a lot of EDI issues, inclusion, diversity, and equity, and many, many other issues and many barriers. I wonder, do you have any case study, any successes in reaching those who have never been heard in the system, who live in the northern and many, many remote areas of the world and have never been heard? Any case studies, any successes would be very helpful to enrich my knowledge. Thank you.
So I have an example. So for example, I work on a community-led project, research project in East London, and there's many Bengali ladies who don't speak English. And one of the things, the way we co-created this project was, I'm part of an advisory group, and we always advise the researchers on, oh yeah, this is good, but we're like, we want to create our own research. So we were brainstorming what kind of issues are there in the community alongside health professionals. And this issue of women not being able to communicate because they can't speak English was huge. So we've co-created this research project with women locally to do ESOL lessons that are targeted for health literacy. So not only are they learning English, but they're also learning about literacy and enabling them to communicate. And the step before this was that actually, even though we kind of came up with this idea, we went to the community and we had 2 focus groups with women that either were pregnant or very recently had children and been through the care system. And it was amazing hearing this. I mean, some of them are heartbreaking, but you know, sometimes they've gone to the hospital very late because they've missed appointments or they didn't even know their appointments, so they get flagged later. You know, there was a lady who just signed something and they took her in for an emergency C-section, for a C-section, like pretty much then and there. She didn't even know what she was signing. Someone else said about, getting, like an epidural, not knowing what that was. So, we definitely realized that there was an issue and women wanted to be empowered. And one of the things as well that came up was that, initially the researcher and the clinician, they're like, oh yeah, we're going to translate all the materials. Yeah. But actually, when you speak to the community, they're like, we don't want them translated because no one is able to read, yeah, in Bengali. Yeah, they want it in English because if it's in English, they can type it in and they can they can put it on their phone. So sometimes what you expect isn't quite, what might be. So I don't. Maybe that's a nice example. Also coming back to the previous example as well, one thing that we found with the women was that to try and, so we're on the next stage now to implement this in hospitals. So it's been tricky. Ethics has been a nightmare. But one of the things that we're doing is using our community researchers who are bilingual, and they are consenting the women in clinics. So they're sitting outside in the, in the space where women are waiting and explaining to them, actually verbally in their own language so that it's a bit clearer. So that's one technique that we've been using.
Okay, thank you. Well, so we need to wrap it up. We have 6 minutes
Just
to
one quick comment on that.
comment.
Yes, I'll keep it quick. No, as an immigrant to Canada, I mean, your comments definitely resonate with me. One thing I think we should all, as researchers, we should kind of keep in mind is how we build our research teams. Because what I've found is that the research coordinators do connect at a personal level with families. And if you have diversity in your research team, it does help a lot, at least in my personal experience, in reaching those families.
Thank you. Okay, we can continue this conversation this afternoon. I'm sure they all be here today and tomorrow. One takeaway message from each one of you in 30 seconds each. 30 seconds.
Clinical trial conduct and workflow is culture. So it has a background on who has to develop it and also who has to undergo the clinical trial. And this is what I learned at the European level. Again, there are quite some diversities, different countries on accepting deferred consent, and you can be frustrated. I feel sorry for the IRBs, but it has to do with the background and the culture, and also the legal construct is something that we as a population have made. So if we want to intervene, we have to intervene at the public level, at the highest potential level, and not at individual level.
Thank you.
My quick takeaway from everything I've heard, and particularly in this panel, would be that the process of conducting research is as important, if not more important, than the output of the research created. So in creating that process, one of the really ways forward and the things that cannot be underemphasized is the need for partnership in doing that research. The need for, we heard, trauma-informed approaches, particularly in this area that may be talking about areas of sensitivities, of tenderness, where we may still be dealing with adversity and challenges. So I think, yeah, partnership, trauma-informed, and caring about our process and governance structure.
I think to try and make trials more equitable and meaningful, I think we've all kind of touched on it, is around involving, patients within the process. I think that's really important. And my takeaway is the importance of the multidisciplinary component. I do think that is really important as well.
I was going to basically say a very similar thing, but nonetheless, I think, to actively write in and engage patient communities throughout is absolutely critical. I think we all experience the impacts at the end of the day, but also we'll get farther together, as much as it's hard to collaborate and work together, and we all speak somewhat different language, not an actual language, but we bring different viewpoints. I think we'll get farther together at the end of the day if we all work together.
For me, I think in addition to all what have been said, spend a lot of time examining your research question. Why are we doing the trial? And spend a lot of time trying to ensure that your trial question aligns with the trial design, because I think we fail a lot of times because our questions don't align with the design. We are choosing different outcomes that are not related to the question, and so on and so forth. So that is extremely critical for anyone designing a trial.
So I'm sure I will be repeating because I'm going last, but we really must all continue to work together. It is no longer acceptable to work in silos. We must work together to change culture and create a culture of inclusion. And that includes working with people with lived experience, working with communities, working with each other, and that's how we can affect change.
Oh, thank you. So thank you, everyone. That was a really wonderful discussion, and I feel in this room, we have a great recipe for success because we are all working together, collaborating, bring a different voice to the table. And I'm very grateful, Lori, that you are doing this work. And I think you're really paving the way to many other countries that want to involve patients in clinical trials. I think our voices, and I can't speak, I can't speak on behalf of all the other parents, and our voices are truly heard in this work. And I'm very grateful for that. And I think we reach a point of no return. There's no way you cannot collaborate. So I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you, everyone.